everyone, and welcome into another episode of the Target Smart podcast. I'm Anthony Sanfilippo, joined as always by your friendly host, Albert Morales. And here we are, Albert. I don't know if we ever thought we'd get here, but we are a little more than a week out from the election. Things are going crazy out there. Everybody's going nuts. This is exactly this was the feeling that I thought we were going to have for the last 2 months. So it was kind of like, well, this has kind of been a little bit, it's not meeting the expectation. Oh boy, is it meeting the expectation now. A lot of craziness, and we're going to talk all about it. But before Albert chimes in and tells you all about our special guest today, I just want to remind everyone to subscribe. That's right. Subscribe to the Target Smart podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to it through YouTube Music as well. But if you're going on YouTube, might as well just watch it because we put the video up as well. So watch us on YouTube. And you can, if you do, hit that like button as well. That also helps us with search optimization. And if you want to connect with us on social media, you can on X at Target Smart, Facebook, Target Smart DC. And we're also on LinkedIn, so find us over there as well. And if you want to email the show and let us know what you think of an episode, or if you want to suggest a guest for an upcoming episode, or just want to tell us how wonderful we are, or if you have criticism, that's okay too. But just how wonderful we are, email us at the Target Smart Podcast at targetsmart.com. And so now, without further ado, Albert, take it away.
Anthony, I think I meant to wear black today, and
what are you in mourning for?
I want to start with the moment of silence for all those Yankees fans who were out there waking up to the terrible news of last night's demise in the Big Apple. So we'll pause for about 3-4 seconds. Anyway,
those of us in down here in the Philadelphia area are not in mourning this morning, just so you know.
Or Boston.
Or Boston. Our friends up north. They're not in mourning. I have a feeling our guest might be in mourning though.
Well, he's loved this guy. So our next guest, Anthony, is Adrian Carrasquillo, who I've been trying to book here for some time. He is our first a journalist that covers politics. I've known Adrian now for a little over a decade. He was and continues to be probably the ace that you rely on for anyone following the Latino electorate. And it's not just what he follows politics more broadly than that. But I think his Rolodex, anyone would argue in this business who has worked in national politics, that Adrian has probably the cell phone of every political operative on both sides of the aisle that he's accrued over the years. Highly respected because of the work that he does. His sources started out at Fox News. We'll let him walk us through his trajectory, but from Fox to BuzzFeed to Newsweek, he's done it all. And I'm excited to have him, and it's timely. Adrian happens to be Puerto Rican, and following the fiasco of Madison Square Garden this past week, I thought, man, it just so happens that we're going to have Adrian on the podcast, and we get to dissect all the ups and downs that come with that horrible event, at least in my view. But without further ado, Anthony, let's bring in our good friend Adrian Carrasquillo.
Hey guys,
good to see you, Adrian. A little subdued this morning.
Am I on the right podcast? I'm here to talk about baseball. I think the
you can join me on my baseball podcast, which I usually record on Fridays if you'd like.
It's just sort of an hour on baseball only, or am I on the wrong one? Thank you guys for having me. Albert is a good dude. I've known him so long in politics, and he was one of the first really legit dudes that I spoke to. And so we really respect each other. We know each other so long, but then that's also where the jokes come in. where I was on a podcast last year with our mutual friend, Chuck Rocha. And Albert was like, the first 7 minutes were you guys just complimenting each other. So I'll try and listen to it again later. So it's always the back and forth. But I mean, it's insane. And I appreciated what you were saying before, Anthony, because it's like, for those of us who are in it, we know this election's going on, and it's crazy, but it reaches another level at some point. And maybe we've been doing this so long, and 2016 rewired everyone's brains that everybody knows it's Trump, and everybody knows what. So it's like eventually you settle into like the bottom of the roller coaster part, and this last week or two has already seemed insane. And I only think the next few weeks are also going to be insane. So.
Agreed. One of the things Albert likes to always have our guests do off the top before we really dive into the meat and potatoes of the conversation is to kind of give a little bit about your background, right? Tell us about your career in journalism, which is interesting to me as a fellow journalist. I always like to know, the steps that people took to get to where they are. So if you don't mind, take us through the history of Adrian in the world of journalism.
The only time you start to feel old is when the years are really far from 2024, and you're like, wait a second. Look, the quick version, because a lot of people have dealt with stuff. There was the Great Recession, and there was me graduating college at a time where I remember thinking, wow, I missed the boat on social media. I wish I had been out when Facebook and Twitter were launching, and of course those became these huge platforms that were foundational for a lot of journalists, over the last decade and more. And got into national news. I started in local news, and I realized that it was just, particularly in New York, it was like a fire in the Bronx or a shooting in Brooklyn, or, it felt like, oh, so local news is just, crime and weather and things. And I really found my love and my passion around, national news. And then you start getting closer into things that you're interested in. And just I've always found, the part of journalism that is news judgment, that is the spotlight that we put on stories. I think that oftentimes I've been a little frustrated when I've seen people talk about certain journalists that might be activists or something like that. And I'm like, certain journalists, they may say where they come from, they either lean left or they lean right, but they're using their news judgment to decide what story is important. And some other journalists who think they're objective do that as well, and they end up ignoring a lot of important stories. So I always thought that that's sort of a part that's frustrating to me. And what I realized, I think, early on and in the last dozen years, is that I could use my news judgment to spotlight things that I was seeing from my learned experience from the people I spoke to, incredible operatives, many of them Latino, that are immersed in politics. And you end up finding interesting things, which is that whether you're in entertainment, in politics, in media, there's a lot of similar things around who's in power, who's in charge, how you get stories greenlit, who cares about what. And so I think we would all agree that, Latino voters are a huge part of this country. And not just that, there's a lot of the coverage that I've done has been around, voices you don't hear a lot. So whether that's, I did immigration coverage for a while, I broke stories on that. And I've done, Black and brown coverage and things around that when protests or when coronavirus came. So, that's sort of where my lane has been. But around elections, it usually turns back to Latino voters. So it's always exciting. It's always pretty crazy.
So that having been said, Adrian, again, you're talking to a lot of reporters, to a lot of political operatives, campaign managers, people out there in the field, in some cases, candidates. The polls are dead even, right? It's a margin of error race, what they call. But as candid as you can be, what is keeping the people that you talk to regularly awake at night at this point? Is it? I guess it's too late now for any sort of November surprise, but
yeah. And I'd love to mention this and then have a conversation with you, Albert, because I know that you have your thoughts on this. I mean, we do know that it's a 50-50 election. And for the people who are, plugged in, like your audience, you also know that voting's already been happening. And so I think that a lot of the Democrats are scared when they see the early voting in Nevada. I sort of, once the data started coming out, I started going through my mind and being like, the Harris campaign hasn't been talking that much about Arizona and Nevada. These are states that in 2020, young Latino voters were literally the margin in helping Joe Biden win, according to Brookings Institute. And now you have suddenly they're not as big a part of the path to victory and stuff like that, and you start wondering why. So I think that just sort of look, it's part and parcel because it's the early vote, but it's also the daunting prospect of a second Trump presidency, and we know that that's ever present in any conversation that people are having. So I would love to talk to you about that because you and I were having sort of like a short kind of early chat last week about some of the early vote stuff. And so how do you see that when you hear that Republicans are kind of like rushing to the polls early in a place like Nevada?
Well, I think what we're seeing is things returning to pre-pandemic norms where a lot of our vote came in on election day, and people, my head just starts to spin when people call me up and they're in a panic because, we're not matching anywhere near our 2020 numbers. And they forget, it's easy to forget. I forget what happened last week, let alone 4 years ago, right? We forget, never mind that we didn't have toilet paper, all those other things. But we were a campaign that was encouraging our electorate to vote by mail, vote early. And that was our message, just run up the score because, you don't want to be around people who aren't vaccinated or whatever at the time. Trump was doing the exact opposite. He was poisoning the well. He was telling everyone of his supporters that vote by mail was not a legit function of the electoral process and that they should vote on election day pretty much. This year it's kind of in reverse, but I think he has poisoned the well in a way that I think limits his ability to maximize early vote amongst Republicans. The evidence is Pennsylvania. I didn't look at the final numbers last night from where we were, but we're leading there. Other things that give me really hope, Adrian, and this is a little bit off topic, but
yeah.
We rarely, if you talk to pollsters who have been at this for a long time, decades, I won't name them, but they will tell you that the Democratic nominee for president has not gotten anywhere close to 50% of the white women vote. When I say sometime, I mean, we're talking LBJ. What was that, 1964? Last time he ran successfully. That's 60 years ago. And I've seen more than a few surveys that have Kamala either 48, 50, 52 in that space. That alone there will, I don't want to say cancel out our deficits among other base voters, but it's going to have a major impact. There's simply just a lot more white voters still. We still live in a very in a majority white country, especially once you start breaking down like Wisconsin, Michigan. People forget it's like 2% white. Anyway, we can go on and on, but I guess I've never been convinced that this is going to be a close election, and I try as best as I can. I sound like a broken record, but I can never fully appreciate or understand what women are going through in this country. And any man who says that they can is not giving it to you straight, because under what conditions would you or I or Anthony go to the hospital and be turned away and asked to go to the parking lot? And I get it. It's only happening in a handful of states. It's only affecting 1 in 3 women right now. But the bottom line is everyone knows someone in Texas, right? You can live in Iowa or New Hampshire, or someone in Georgia, someone in Florida. We're all connected in some way or the other. So this idea that women are not going to be, who don't live in these states aren't going to be as motivated enough to to go vote on election day because of abortion, I think is ill-conceived. But anyway, didn't mean to venture off topic there, Adrian, but it's just
and if I can jump in real quick, because this is where this is what I wanted to ask Adrian, because I know you talk to people on both sides of the aisle here. So we obviously know why the panic is there on the Democratic side. I think it's a little bit too much panic. As Albert just pointed out, obviously the Republicans are pushing early vote, which they didn't do 4 years ago, and so of course they're going to get closer in the early vote data. I mean, it just makes sense because they're doing it now, whereas they didn't do it 4 years ago. But we have not really heard, and I have not really seen a lot of media that talks about things that the Republican side is worried about. And Albert talks about the white woman vote, and I think that he's right. I think that that's where this election is going to come down to, suburban white women. Are you hearing anything on your side from the people that you're talking to about concerns on the Republican side that maybe, just hasn't gotten out there in the media just yet?
It's fascinating because I think with Republican, or at least when you get to the two major parties, you have to do a little bit of the chess of figuring out what the MAGA movement is trying to put out there, what Trump, people have basically already said he's going to declare victory at night, no matter what happens, right? So when I start seeing stories where I think New York Times had a story, and there was another one about they're very excited by what they're seeing, the data. They're very encouraged. Like, I'm not shocked that they're seeing the same data we're seeing, and they're like, oh, all right, well, this is great. There's this part of me that's always sort of like, well, do they also want it to seem that he's going to win? And then, whoa, what happened here? Because they are setting up a stolen election. It's just a fact. I oftentimes think as a journalist, you don't want to, unnecessarily worry people, but we have to be honest about the situation. We know he tried to steal the election in 2020 when he was president. So, and I think that the closeness of the election could be an issue this cycle on that, which is something I've been thinking about lately. But look, I think all roads lead back to Pennsylvania, and I think that's what they're scared about. I think that's what they're terrified about. I don't think the early vote has looked great for them in Pennsylvania, and we know that that's Harris' path to victory. I personally have sort of been Charlie Brown, Lucy with the football too often with North Carolina, where I sort of don't believe it. And I've seen numbers where I'm just like, I don't think that that's a swing state. Obama was the last one to win it. Georgia has seemed primed to swing back for a while. Arizona, Biden only won by 11,000 votes. So, it just feels like Pennsylvania is really her only path, and obviously Michigan, Wisconsin. And so I think that that's the biggest thing that's keeping Republicans up at night.
So, Adrian, switching gears here, I want to switch over to the Latino vote because that's, you and I have had many a conversation about the Latino vote over the years. But, we'll get to the Puerto Rican vote soon. But I think we're on the verge of something big in Texas, and I'm not predicting, Texas turning blue on Tuesday by any means. A lot of factors involved there, but fast forward if we could to 2028, and what the country looks like when Texas will in fact be a battleground state, whether Republicans and the punditry like it or not. What's held us back? And I've written about this before, but over half of Latino voters are concentrated in 3 states, and they all happen to be non-battleground states: California, or Texas, Florida, and California, ranked in the order of importance to me. What does that look like to you, 2028? When we're talking 20 media markets, I get excited about it because how do you carve that up? I think the closest we've had in recent memory as a comparison would probably be Florida, right? Mm-hmm. But what does that political landscape look like to you? Fast forwarding to 2028, when I think it will, in fact, be fertile ground for, the right Democrat.
There's so much there. Let's preface it by, I think people would be hard pressed for a national political reporter to find someone who's written more Texas could go blue stories. So trust me, I'm open and aware of the demographic possibilities. I will also say we've been talking about one of the first meetings I had, which I think is okay to talk about. I think the off the record is expired. One of the first meetings I had in my career was with like Joaquin Castro and Julian Castro in like 2013 or 2014. And it was, the sort of, these guys are coming up and could Texas turn blue? So we've also been talking about it for a while. And I think to your point, and then also I would say that you and I have talked so often, and you were always one of the people that said to me, hey, look, Adrian, I've got pretty conservative or moderate family in Texas. Here's what I hear from them, you being a Democratic Party operative and that helping you in your work to get a little bit of a gut check sometimes. And sometimes maybe we're here on any issue from many progressives, whether it's immigration or anything else. And so I've always been also cognizant that the Latino electorate in Texas looks different than in other places, and that there's some things going on in the Southwest or in Pennsylvania that are not happening in Texas. So with clearing that out, look, if we start moving even more, because you see, I've always been intrigued by Allred versus Cruz, because I don't think people particularly like Ted Cruz. I don't think even Republicans like Ted Cruz. He underperforms Trump. He got very close to losing to Puerto. I think this is going to be another close election. So I think what it really helps is, it's interesting because I think that voters in these states that are particularly partisan sometimes don't know it's actually better for your state if you are a competitive state. It's better if Republicans have to go down there and explain why their policies are good. This is an interesting time for me because I've been freelancing for every place possible while I work on some personal projects that I'm excited about and stuff. And so, I was writing one about climate because I never get to do that. I'm doing this 3-part series with Latino Newsletter where Hispanic Federation was like, hey, let's highlight some of the big groups that are doing the amazing work that you and I both know these groups do. But in Mi Familia Vota, and I did like Poder Latinx and Copal in Minnesota, because I thought it was cool that in an election where we focus on these 6 or 7 states, this small thing, what about if we talk about what's going to happen after the election? What about if we talk about, in the most important election of our lifetime, the most pressing issue of our lifetime that people always talk about is climate? And so in a place like Texas, they were telling me that the average Texan has an electric bill of $151.36, and that the extreme heat and the possibility of hurricanes is an issue. So, there's different issues you can talk to Latino voters on. And I think it's actually better for the state, for the voters, when it's a competitive state and you have these debates. What happens now is in a race with, say, Greg Abbott, he can do one debate if he wants. Maybe he doesn't even need to. And you don't get to talk about those issues. So obviously, you and I both know, and everybody knows, that would be an earthquake if that became something where the polling was even saying, oh, this is a 2 or 3 point state, because now it's serious, and now that you can force Republicans to spend money there to defend that state. So yes, a increasingly blue Texas is a fascinating prospect.
Well, I think 2026 will be. Everyone thinks that this race ends after November, but I think this is just simply a battle for women. For example, I know going back to the topic of women here, but their battle is really in these state legislatures, the governorships. And in 2026, just so happens that you have all the big states that have enacted these archaic abortion laws that are up. The governorships, state legislature, Texas, Florida, Georgia, etc. But so I guess it's premature to start getting too excited about 2028. But I do want to move on to
Albert. You're always looking ahead, Albert. you how many times have you said on this show that we are in a perpetual cycle, right?
Well, we are, We are, but
with Albert, it's always a noun and a verb in Texas, right? So it's not surprising.
Exactly.
This is his agenda.
But hey, I used to work for Terry McAuliffe. It was my first gig at the Democratic National Committee back in 2001 on redistricting of all things. So it was more of a numbers project, trying to get these, frankly, better maps for Democrats. But I'll never forget, after the Kerry Edwards campaign lost in 2004, he referred to it to a reporter as political malpractice. And that thought came to mind as soon as I saw that Madison Square Garden, I don't know what you call it, land rally, whatever it was, but I couldn't believe that. And this is after learning, of course, that the speakers had been vetted. This guy, who is not worthy of being named, has a history of producing an act that is based on race. He's been banned from nightclubs like in Houston, in Texas, because he was so harsh towards the Asian American community. I learned that this morning listening to Scott Braddock, who has a great podcast coming out of Texas, him and Jeremy Wallace from the Houston Chronicle. But I started, getting to know who this guy was. But how could you possibly bring this guy to Madison Square Garden, just over a week before the election? And it shifted the narrative. Puerto Ricans and Latinos, we all have a right to be offended. But were you as shocked as everybody else was? Or I think you and I asked that, Adrian, because I think you and me, no offense to Anthony, we see things through a different prism, right? Just based on who we are.
Yeah. I'm going to steal this from a New York Times opinion columnist that I saw talking on TikTok. And he said that Republicans and Trump broke one of the 10 crack commandments, which is don't get high on your own supply. And I loved it.
That is great.
Because we get GOTV, we get talking to your base. And then it's like, is your base just only interested in racist jokes about Black people, Jews, Latinos, Puerto Ricans? Because so the thing happens to the community. And I'm going to get to how I felt about it and all the insane fallout that has happened, which we could do a podcast just on that. My buddy, who's an extremely respected journalist, and I will tell this story because I think you guys will appreciate it. He is a producer who is one of the best in the game. And when he showed me his incredible ability one time, he was doing a report, and they went to an old school diner, and it was a TV report, and they did and literally the white people were on one side of the diner, the Black people were on the other side. So the anchor went and spoke to the Black residents, and then spoke to the white people and said, "All right, we're done here for our story." And my friend, who's Mexican American, said, "No, let's go to the kitchen and talk to the Latinos." So, and that's when I was just like, this guy is on a different level in terms of his understanding of and his talent in news. So he was at a comedy club the day before the MAGA rally, and this jokester comes up and starts making jokes. And it was the same guy that made the Puerto Rico comments, because he was testing out his set. NBC News actually wrote about this, by the way. And not only was the guy making the same jokes that were not going over well, that he said, "Oh, this will go over better tomorrow in the MAGA rally." That guy, Tony, said. But
He was right.
My friend, he was there with his boyfriend, and the guy was making gay jokes because he saw them. So, I mean, this guy is just clearly the worst. Okay. So with that being said, I think that, look, we all love our cultures. We all love where we're from. So it's not some huge shock that people don't like to hear where they're from is garbage. But I think when you're Puerto Rican, you have what I've been saying is a century of colonialism to go along with that. When I was covering sort of the Puerto Rico barnstorm that happens every 4 years, Hillary Clinton and Marco Rubio were there on the same day in 2016, and I was there. And I was like, "Oh, this is so cool." Marco Rubio's at a restaurant. Hillary Clinton's doing a healthcare thing. And we were talking, guys, about a healthcare crisis and a financial crisis in the 2016 election. What happened since then is Hurricane Maria, right? So there's always Puerto Ricans always sort of feel battered and beat down. You're U.S. citizens, but you can't vote. You have people say all the things, and on both sides, they come and they say, oh, they're going to do stuff for Puerto Rico. Nothing happens for Puerto Rico. You have federal money that's not being released, post, the hurricane flattening the island. The power is always going out. There's a fiscal control board. There's so many issues there. And what you have is you love your island. You respect your island. They're Puerto Rican. No one puts out their flag more than Puerto Ricans, right? And I heard that's like a legacy of back when you weren't allowed to promote that you were Puerto Rican, and so people came to love their culture and their flag.
I've always wondered, Anthony. So when this fiasco happened, I was trying to explain it to another friend of mine who's also white, and I said, "Listen, you know how white people, you have the Irish, the Italians, you can go down the list. The Italians are the most passionate people, I think, of the lot. You could not have picked the worst community to offend than the Puerto Rican community, because they're very proud people of who they are, right?
I always, and I always go back to, I think, something that we know intellectually in politics. Hypocrisy is what gets people activated. When Republicans want to say, you can't take my gun, you can't take this, but they're in your bedroom. So then people say, well, wait a second. I thought that you were, not about government control. And I think that with Puerto Ricans, they're U.S. citizens, right? So when you start doing this thing about, you start with criminals and rapists, and now suddenly you're ending up with your island that you don't treat so well is floating garbage. We all know, we went through it. The comedian, Trump is trying to act like. But what I have found interesting is that the story is not going away, and that it dovetailed. From my reporting, I was talking to the Harris campaign at the time, and I said on Twitter that they were like the meme from The Office where Michael Scott is running around the office saying, "Oh my God, okay, it's happening," about the Bad Bunny endorsement. They knew that he was going to share the Kamala Harris policy, but the way that it dovetailed with this guy talking crap about Puerto Ricans, and then the biggest, most popular star who I on Twitter talked about is like the Taylor Swift or the Beyonce for Latinos and for Puerto Ricans, where he was breaking records and he's the #1 artist on Spotify 3 years running. I'm basically like, it's hard for endorsements to matter. It's hard for this stuff to break through. You and I both know there's been so much early voting, but this is something that really has pissed people off. And to do it in a place like Pennsylvania was political malpractice, like you said.
Yeah, and Adrian, look, and I'll say this, and I think you're going to agree with me on this, but I'll throw it to you anyway. As a journalist, like a lot of times we sit there and we look at like PR people, we look at the people who run campaigns, and we say they have to know what is going to go over well and what is not going to go over well, don't they? And so when you look at it and say, well, we vetted this guy to go on and perform at this, like that, you say we say malpractice, but somebody's got to lose their job for that, because in all honesty, he had a little bit of momentum, right? I mean, Kamala she had a few interviews that didn't go so well the last 10 days, I guess, prior to that. So there's a little bit of momentum for Trump at that point. And then to have, we all knew that the rally was coming and this was going to be a big thing at Madison Square Garden. All eyeballs were going to be on it because the media had no choice but to do it because of where it was. How do you even let somebody like that walk through the door to get up to the microphone? Like that to me is the thing that blew my mind more than anything else, that they allowed that to happen. Because as a journalist, I look at it and go, if I was a PR guy, I would be fired. Like you have to know going in, don't you?
I think what you're touching on, and I've heard other journalists say it, is that Trump has always had this dynamic where he's got some serious political people, the Kellyanne Conways, who've been around for decades, and he's got a lot of people that are just sort of either hangers on or not that experienced to know what you're talking about. As you were speaking, I was also thinking, it's almost like if Harris was doing a rally in one of the most red places, there'd be a little danger there. There'd be a little bit of there could be some backlash. She's got to be careful what she says. And I think because all eyes were on MSG, that was already something where a lot of people were, bringing back the fact that there was a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden, and so like decades ago. And so I don't think that, and it gets back to the getting high on your own supply thing. Like, I don't think that there was like care taken and real understanding of where we are and what the rally in and of itself was going to draw a lot of attention. So of course, what was said there, and again, look, I mean, we have to be honest. Sometimes we over analyze this stuff. They love their red meat. They think it's fun to play with liberals, to mess, to push the media, and then they come to find out sometimes that, well, actually, voters do care when you disrespect them, and they want to be treated with dignity, And so anyway, I think that's part of what happened here too.
Okay, this is a topic that I've been really looking forward to. Even though I'm a millennial, I'm not up there with all the.
That you were Gen Z, Albert, no?
Did you just call yourself a millennial, Albert?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm a millennial, Anthony. I'm a millennial.
Start using this term. Elder millennial has come out now, which I hate.
Oh, aren't we the same age, Albert? I think we're the same age, right?
No, I'm what they call a millennial emeritus. That said, I'm not. It's not my genre. No offense, anytime like Cardi B or a Latino artist comes out with something, I always download it just to support them. Never listen to it, but I want to be supported. But for those who don't know, who are of my age, Bad Bunny versus Mark Anthony versus J-Lo, what's the significance there? I know you talked about, I think you were referencing Bad Bunny having been on top of the charts for the past 3 years. And you can skip over any millennial.
I mean, what I like to tell people first is my bona fides. I went to 3 of his concerts post-pandemic year, and I went to a 4th one last year. I mean, he's the best, and he's sort of like the king of reggaeton. Think of it that way. Which Daddy Yankee for many years was that. But I mean, he was breaking tour records for a Latin artist, like right after 2022, I think it was, because he did 2 tours back to back. He did an arenas tour and then a stadium tour, that's where we start getting into Taylor Swift and Beyonce level, and he made millions upon millions of dollars doing that. But so where I think he matters, where J-Lo is very popular, Mark Anthony, Luis Fonsi, they always sort of come out around election time, and they always back, Biden in 2020 and Hillary in 2016. I think Bad Bunny brings some of that credibility because he's not sort of in the Democrats' pocket. In fact, for most of the cycle, what I had heard, the reason he hadn't gotten out there is, again, sort of not being exactly loving with Democrats and progressives. What they always want his endorsement, they always want his support, but they're not really doing much on Puerto Rico. So he spent like $150,000 on billboards in Puerto Rico, calling the ruling party corrupt. He's against the governor. He's focused on Puerto Rico elections. But I think, again, this confluence of events, and people were pushing behind the scenes, but I had heard from the Harris campaign who told me we just don't want to piss him off. Like, they don't want to make it seem like they are owed his endorsement, because that's not going to go over well. So it was sort of just like, hey, we'll see how it goes. And what I told people a month ago, 6 weeks ago, was if anyone would have an effect on Latino men or Puerto Ricans, in a place like Pennsylvania, I think it would only be him, because we know that endorsements are sort of often, overinflated their importance. So I just think that he's a singular figure who's respected, and he's young, and young people will be like, oh, wow, this is crazy. Because I do think Trump gets an advantage when sort of the cool, men in combat sports and music, athletes, and rap are backing him. Then young people and people who are apathetic or not as into politics are like, oh, yeah, Trump's cool. It's pretty bad for Democrats if your first thought about Trump is he's cool and not January 6th or a litany of other things that these people might have been too young to really know the entire Trump resume.
Anthony, you're a Gen Xer, unlike me. What would be the comparable there of a superstar coming out in support of
for my generation, well, I mean, you've already seen, Springsteen has done it so many times, right?
I guess
politically,
that'd be the closest.
I mean, I guess, he probably goes even a little bit into the boomers as well, because he really was more in the 70s, but although Born in the USA came out in 85. So that's starting with, us Gen Xers were starting to get into music at that time.
I saw a guy on CNN, and I'm forgetting his name, but he was on with our friend Chuck Rocha, and he was saying that they had looked at this, and the only endorsement that ever mattered was Oprah, where she gave the permission structure for people to leave Hillary and go to Obama. I'm sure other endorsements have mattered in geographical pockets, right? But I understand where they're like a huge one.
Yeah, well, and that was going to be my question, Adrian, and you did touch on it a little bit there, but endorsements are endorsements, right? And I know there's been a lot made of endorsements, obviously, with the Washington Post situation and the LA Times situation, like all that's coming to a head right now. But we really know that for the most part, endorsements are just what they are. But are there certain pockets and communities where they matter more, right? Then and I think there are, right?
I think so, and I think in journalism, you got to be careful when you go too much to one side. Now suddenly everybody's endorsements don't matter at all. Well, there's a reason people want them. Besides the news cycle, besides the press hit, I think back to Cindy McCain in 2020. And the reason I do is because, and I talked about this at the top, I'm the person who's going to say, hey guys, Latino voters had this huge role in this election. You might want to pay attention to that. Jonathan Martin, who's an excellent longtime national political correspondent, said, Cindy McCain had a huge effect on Arizona in 2020. And I say both are true. You've got somebody who, there's a lot of John McCain Republicans. A lot of the reason that Kari Lake is likely going to lose in Arizona is because there's a lot of folks that are not necessarily buying the Trump and heels thing. Trump's got his base like anywhere in the country, and his base can be enough to win elections sometimes, along with disaffected voters. But, right, in 2020, you have high-profile Cindy McCain coming out, giving that permission, I think, for Republicans to say, yeah, I don't like this guy. Yeah, you know what? She brings up a good point. And it's like, I want to make a comparison between Albert and I know people who do Spanglish like ads and stuff, and you're sort of like, why? Or where you hear some words in Spanish in the ad, and they say, because if you're getting your kid ready for school, if you're ironing a shirt, if you're having breakfast and it's on in the background on your Spotify, and you hear words in Spanish, your ear kind of starts listening, and now you're listening to the ad. And so that makes me think about someone like Cindy McCain, for a Republican in Arizona, who's sitting on his couch and, is kind of over. We're all sort of over the politics, but who do you listen to? And who does your ear say, they're making some interesting points. So anyway, I do think that's important, particularly when you have the Fox News of the world that are basically a megaphone for MAGA.
Adrian, before we wrap up, there's one topic we've discussed. Latino men, you and I have had many conversations about their voting behavior, and how we're so diverse, right? But I think what's been missing in this conversation is the mental health aspect. In politics, it can be tough. I mean, I'm not too proud to share that I've battled depression over the course of my life. In this business, we're humans, right?
Yeah.
We want to be loved. My mistake was working for the Democratic Party, for the Democratic National Committee, on 3 separate occasions where the answer is always no, and I always, for whatever reason, I felt like that response was disproportionately leveled on me. Everyone thinks of the party as this big bank account that can just, magically throw money at things and solve the problem. It's a presidential vehicle. It's used every 4 years to get our nominee across the finish line. But you go on, right? What's the prayer? Allow me to focus on things that I can control and not those that I cannot. I'm paraphrasing, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that after the dust settles and, legal challenges. Hopefully there won't be any because it'll be such a commanding win that we don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. But I almost think that there has to be some kind of commission on mental health aimed at men of color specifically, because there are, I think, even though our problems are similar in nature to the white men that live in, where I come from, which is the sticks near my farm, we all have this. We all have these shared goals, but I do think that, going back to my earlier point, you and I see things through a different prism than some of those men. But it would behoove, I think, politicians on both sides of the aisle to open up more about that conversation. Mental health has always had this sort of taboo about it, right? Oh, you need to go see your shrink, or you're crazy, or whatever. And even for me, I was brought up in a very conservative, evangelical home where, you talk to your problems to God. But I remember getting mad at God when I was little because I couldn't understand things. I'm like, you're supposed to be there for me all the time. But later in life, I realized that that attitude was an act of faith, because I knew that he was there, but he was just, for whatever reason, he wanted me to struggle so that it would make me stronger. And it did as a result. I mean, your thoughts, I don't know if you ever talked to anybody.
I would start, let's zoom out first just to men in general. I've seen stuff where people are talking about writing books and they say men don't read books, right? So you can't write books. There's all these books aimed at women. And then you're just sort of like, men don't read books. And that's sort of like a sad thing if you think about that, because then there's not going to be as much of that. And so I go from that to, let's zoom in a little bit, on men of color. I mean, young men in this country are a little bit more, disproportionately more men of color. And I think that the same stuff that's happening in social media, the same stuff, I see a lot of podcasts, I see a lot of content aimed at women, and that's great. But there is not as much stuff aimed at men, except for right-leaning stuff, Joe Rogan, and I say yes, and I say also sports, like Cameron and Mace are two hilarious rappers, and they started a sports show. And look, sports is great, right? But let sort of that rounding out the media diet, because let's take a generous look for a second. Not just Joe Rogan, but others. It's jokes, but he brings on people who are Neil deGrasse Tyson to talk about the universe, and different people, right? To talk, and a lot of the stuff that is aimed at men is also like, get your body right, become huge. And it's like, there's different aspects. And I'm not saying any of that stuff is bad, but where's the part about the mental health piece? Look, I mean, I've got friends, and a buddy of mine who is, he's the best. And he came from Cuba, and he says, when he came here, he moved to Wisconsin. And so he just used to get in fights. People used to pick on him all the time. So he just used to have to punch kids in the face and stuff. So he comes from this thing where he's like, I'm very pick myself up from my bootstraps. And I'm like, that's amazing. That reminds me of my dad. That's cool. There's also the part that there's nothing wrong with going to therapy and asking for help and talking to people. I get that from my sister being a therapist. And men are very resistant to talking to people, like if you've got a problem. So you mentioned political people. I think the Latino groups, I think the whole infrastructure of these groups, and also Black groups, I think that men of color are being left behind. And you've seen this, the Atlantic has written about the loneliness epidemic. And they've talked about, even in the 90s, there was no more bowling leagues, and Americans were turning more inward. And that has only accelerated post the pandemic. And so, people are lonely, and people are, there's all this content, but there seems to be I think it's actually would be an opportunity, like any business opportunity. There's money to be made there, actually, I think, and people to help. So that's something that is interesting to me, and something I care about for sure.
I'm glad you bring that up, Adrian, because I'm fortunate in that I work in two different worlds, and one of them is geared toward the 18 to 54-year-old male demographic, which is sports.
Yeah.
Right. And in that world, you don't hear any of this. right? Or you for 25 years that I've been doing it, you haven't heard any of this. Until a little bit recently, it's starting to make some inroads there, right? I actually talked to a former major league pitcher who had to stop pitching because of mental health reasons, because he couldn't convince himself that he was good enough to keep going at that level, because he kept getting hurt, he had injuries, and he just broke down, and actually sought help and is feeling a lot better now, which is good for him. But like it's taboo to talk about it in that world. But then you get to come into this world and you realize that, oh my God, people talk about this all the time. Right? Like it's like, this is totally fine. This is a normal conversation to have. Why is it not in the other world? And it's because what you're saying, there is no outreach to those individuals to say that it's okay to discuss it, because you have to feel like you have to have this machismo, right? That you got to be macho, and you got to fight through that, right? That's kind of what you're taught. And so it's interesting that we're starting to see it slowly permeate into that world.
Yeah, you have Dan Levitard has talked about losing his brother. It's so emotional, oh man, every time you watch it. Steven Jackson has the All the Smoke podcast, and you know, I had a former boss who used to say that a good story is touching 2 live wires. So we're all political obsessives. A political story, we're going to read it. But what about if you combine politics and entertainment? What about when you combine politics and technology? Okay, now we've got something that has a larger audience than just politics. So I often think, like, I think people might hear something like this and be like, whoa, mental health in sports. But actually, all you would be doing is making the audience bigger and giving them a little something different. So, today our podcast is only 97% sports. You know what I mean? Like, so I do think that there's a lot of interesting stuff there, because, you know, men are humans as well.
Yeah, sports is a mind game at the end of the day, right? Whether it's golf.
Well, they all are. Everything we do is a mind game. And like there is such a correlation between what goes on in sports and what goes on in politics. They've traveled the same parallel paths. They go in the same directions, and it should be okay in both sides.
And I often also tell people, I don't like to act like politics is sports, because it's not a game. People's lives are at stake. But where politics is like sports is the narrative. One of these 2 candidates is going to win, and it's going to be like 51-49. But they're going to act like, well, now they have a mandate. And particularly, that's where I think Republicans get in trouble, because I always say, like, if they were like, well, we won a close election and now we're going to put in our policies. Instead, they're like, the blood of our opponents is upon the field, and now we will sweep in as Emperor Trump will enact Project 2025. And it's like, whoa, hold on a second. I don't think the country has it. So that's why they're going to get their butts kicked in 2026 if they were to win, because it's always this overreaction instead of sort of like, what about if we help people and show people that this is good for the future of the country, you know? But
Adrian, you tell people in New York and Boston and Philadelphia that sports does not affect their lives.
Oh, too soon, Anthony.
I won't get my thought on the guy who took the ball out of Mookie Betts' glove.
Hey, Adrian, you know, I know you're working on some big projects, and we would be honored and would love to have you back on either later in the year or next year, whenever you're ready to release to the masses what it is you're working on. I can tell everybody who's watching or listening that it will be good. I can guarantee you. Adrian never puts out anything that doesn't captivate the reader, you know, within the first minute of reading. So I'm expecting big things.
Thank you.
Anthony, you got any closing remarks?
No, I want to thank Adrian for coming on. It's great to have a perspective of a journalist on this show. I got excited when you told me that Adrian was coming on. More excited than any other guest we've had. And we had Jamie Harrison, Adrian, on this show. Really cool. Okay, I was more excited for this because I get to rub elbows with another journalist. It's good. It's good conversation. No, I really want to thank you for coming on. It's always a treat to have great guests, and you've been one for sure. So thank you for being part of it. And I just want to remind our listening audience to subscribe to the Target Smart Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, wherever you get it. Subscribe here on YouTube if you're watching us. Hit that like button. It makes a difference. Connect with us on X, at Target Smart, Facebook, Target Smart DC, and on LinkedIn. And you can email us, like I said at the beginning of the show. Email us at the Target Smart Podcast at targetsmart.com. So for Albert Morales, our guest, Adrian Carrasquillo, I'm Anthony Sanfilippo. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again next week.